because I said what was on my mind. I made a lot of enemies. I made a lot
Welcome, everyone, to Science From the Fringe. My name is Bryce Nickels. I'm a professor of genetics at Rutgers University, and I'm very excited to be joined today by Louis Kamb. Louis is an investigative reporter for US Right to Know, who specializes in using freedom of information laws and public records to expose wrongdoing. Before he joined US Right to Know, he worked at NBC News as their first ever national FOIA reporter, and prior to that, he worked as a watchdog reporter for the Seattle Times, where he shared a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on how Boeing's negligence and regulatory failures contributed to the 737 MAX disasters. So, Louis, thank you very much for joining me today. Could you tell us a little bit about your Pulitzer Prize-winning reporting at the Seattle Times?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me, Bryce. I appreciate it. It's nice to be here. I worked on a team of reporters that was led by an outstanding beat reporter, Dominique Gates, who had covered Boeing for something like 20 plus years. And so he has a great foundation of knowledge. And they brought myself and some other investigative reporters in 2018 after the first 737 MAX crash. And then subsequently, a couple months later, there was another crash, as you might recall. And kind of implicated in that was a change in their software system, flight control software system that hadn't been reported to pilots, really. They hadn't done tests on this new software system that had this glitch that ultimately, in certain situations, because of lack of redundancies in kind of the safety equipment, caused the nose of the plane to dive, essentially. And that there are ways that you can pull out of a situation like that, but none of these pilots had been trained on it, and largely because Boeing was cutting corners for cost saving, bottom line issues. And ultimately we did a number of reports showing proving this, and showing that on top of that, the federal regulators at the FAA hadn't been up to the task that they were supposed to be, helping to oversee public safety on these particular planes that were new in the Boeing lineup. So it was anytime you're involved in an investigation like that, it's a bit bittersweet because you're talking about a catastrophe, tragedy, that leads you to, try to do these reports that go after accountability and show that something went wrong badly. And so, I mean, it's nice to get that kind of validation and from prizes and that sort of thing. But really, the kind of the journey of going through those reports with my colleagues is, probably the biggest thing I took away from that. Just having that opportunity to work with such an outstanding team, and then being able to write these reports that helped to change things, really, and ultimately led to some of the things you saw in the congressional investigations of that, and ultimately led to some new laws and that sort of thing.
You're known for your use and expertise in, accessing information through the Freedom of Information Act and in requests, using what's, referred to as FOIAs. Can you explain what the Freedom of Information Act is and what FOIAs are?
Sure, absolutely. Yes. Freedom of Information Act requests have been around since the 60s. This is basically, as one of my mentors used to call it, the people's subpoena. So you and I and anybody in the public can find out, or purportedly we can find out, what's going on at our government agencies by submitting requests to these agencies and asking for their records. And, now all 50 states have some version of the FOIA, their own state kind of public records request system. But the federal FOIA is the one that, covers all federal agencies such as the National Institutes of Health or, the CIA, FBI, you name it. There's a few areas where you can't, that are written out of the FOIA where they're exempt from the FOIA law. But generally speaking, agencies that are government agencies that have records are fair game to request records from. Of course, they have like 10 or 11 exemptions where they cite these exemptions and say, well, we can't give you this record for national security reasons or for privacy concerns or, a number of other ones. But generally speaking, you're supposed to get these records, and then they have to, basically explain why they're not giving the records to you.
Are there any tricks of the trade, so to speak, with respect to FOIA requests, like strategies that one could use to access information by perhaps trying to go to multiple agencies or use state laws versus federal laws?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of tricks, and it really is case by case dependent. But what we're talking about essentially is you want to write to begin with. You want to write a really clear, specific request. A lot of problems people have is I think they know what they want, but sometimes they make it so broad. Their language is so broad when they say any and all. That is a huge flag that allows the FOIA officer to basically, deny your request is overly broad. So the first tip is just to be very narrow in your request. If you could cite exactly what a record is, sometimes we can't, but if you know a specific record, like, report number 33 that has 11 pages and was authored by, John Smith, that's what you ask for rather than any and all record.
And you would find that by stumbling upon the existence of that in some other document?
Yes, and you do it in a couple ways. I mean, sometimes I'm putting together FOIAs just by brainstorming. Sometimes it is like you say, you're reading another document, you're doing research, and you stumble upon, you know, somebody citing a record, and I'd like to see that record. So you ask for that specific record.
You recently moved to US Right to Know. Can you talk a little bit about how US Right to Know is a little bit different from conventional or traditional media?
Yeah, absolutely. So, U.S. Right to Know is a small nonprofit news organization. We've got a staff that's dedicated to raising transparency in certain public health issues. On one side of the ledger, we've got reporters and scientists who are looking at kind of GMO foods and pesticides and bad things in the environment, that sort of thing. And on the other side, you have we're keying in on risky research in COVID-19 origins. And that's what I'm tasked with doing primarily, is to look into risky research in COVID-19 origins. But U.S. Right to Know, it was started, something like 10 years ago by a guy named Gary Ruskin, who he founded it. And he's a guy who for years and years worked in Ralph Nader's consumer organization back in Washington, D.C. He's somebody who knows a lot of players back in Washington, D.C., and this is something that's near and dear to his heart. So he's based out in the Bay Area here on the West Coast. I'm in Seattle, but we have folks really all over the place who are part of this endeavor. And we have a couple of staff scientists. We also have reporters, as well as, Gary, who oversees it all. And we have, researchers and investigators and that sort of thing. But we're a small staff, and we rely on donations primarily and grants. And through usually journalism grants, we're part of what's known as the Investigative News Network, which is an affiliation of something like 500 nonprofit investigative news organizations across the U.S. And I think like the biggest one might be ProPublica. People might be familiar with that. That's a nonprofit investigative news site. And we're probably on the smaller scale of things. What's attractive about this job for me, though, coming from corporate news, NBC News, where I was, as you mentioned, the FOIA reporter, national FOIA reporter, was, U.S. Right to Know really kind of hits above its weight, and it has done some just phenomenal stuff in terms of obtaining records that even NBC wasn't doing. And that is by, Gary has some very good connections in the FOIA legal community, where we're getting a lot of lawyers who are working with us on a shoestring or for free, pro bono, who are filing as soon as as soon as the FOIA request we put in has lapsed, where they're supposed to respond within 20 days or respond to our request for expedited processing and that sort of thing. As soon as something like that has happened, we're very aggressive about taking those agencies to court. And really, FOIA is such a difficult process now, and people have so much problem getting records, that you really need to have that kind of legal consequence or that litigation strategy to really pry anything loose. And that's what's really remarkable about U.S. Right to Know. We now have something like a dozen lawsuits going, FOIA lawsuits going to various agencies.
It's not as simple as we submit a request to the government and then a couple days later we get what we asked for. What you're talking about is there's a lot of just difficulty with obstructionism when you try to get information from these agencies. So what's the cost associated with filing FOIA requests? Is it something that, members of the public really have the ability to do? Because is it, in terms of, you talked about the time involved, but what about the time and cost? Would that make it so that individual members of the public really are prohibited in many ways from using FOIAs?
I would say no, it doesn't prohibit the public. I have an advantage because I have, U.S. Right to Know has at its disposal a couple of very good legal firms that works with us. I mean, that helps us tremendously. But just as an individual person, you could file a FOIA request and be fairly successful. And people do this a lot. In fact, individual reporters, you see, I won't think of one off the top of my head, unfortunately, but there are individual folks out there that have made kind of a name for themselves by being able to obtain FOIAs. And a lot of it is just learning strategies, and a lot of it is just persistence. But, one of the more preeminent FOIA reporters out there is a guy named Jason Leopold. You may have heard of him. He works for Bloomberg News. He's probably, the model FOIA reporter out there because he is so tenacious and he goes after it, and he knows the strategies and he knows how to craft FOIA requests. But again, he also has a team of lawyers behind him that is helping him get these records. And it's not, sometimes it takes years and years and years to get these records. And that's in the case of U.S. Right to Know, we're just starting to get some of the records, that are dated 2014, 2016 from NIH now. And this is after 3, 4, 5 years of putting in our request.
Why are some of these requests so hard to get filled? Is it obfuscation, or is it underfunding of the agencies that are responsible for, dealing with the requests?
I mean, I think it's a little bit of both. I think some agencies are a lot better, more responsive, I should say, than others. Some of them, it's like a black hole. There are certain agencies that, if you put in a request, you're probably not going to see anything for a long, long time. And there's like the CIA, for instance. I have trouble getting anything out of them. NIH has been actually quite difficult for getting a lot of records, although we are now on a production schedule with several of our FOIAs where a court has ordered them to produce, X number of pages or process X number of pages per month. And so they've been doing that now and hitting their marks, but it took years in a lawsuit to get there.
That's shocking, right? That the NIH currently is still having trouble fulfilling FOIAs. Do you find that surprising given the promises made by the new administration of having this radical transparency?
No, I don't find it surprising, unfortunately. I mean, it seems like since I've gotten into this kind of specialty of putting in requests, particularly FOIA requests, like, you know, it, each administration, no matter who's at the top, it's kind of the same story. Um, you know, it takes forever to get records. You get records denied that shouldn't be denied, and it's just like an uphill battle the entire time. That's not to say every agency is like that. Like I say, there are some good ones. Just the ones we are, interested in getting records from, they're difficult to get records from. These are the ones that are the larger agencies that have, thousands of employees that have, tens of thousands of records that potentially could be, responsive to a request. And there is some administrative, log jams here. There's no question about that. But in terms of what was kind of, the thought when the Trump administration came in, regardless of, where your personal politics may lie, is there was this kind of a promise that we're going to make things more transparent. And even like the, director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, went out and said, we're going to be more transparent than any administration, particularly in these areas. And one of them was COVID-19 origins. And unfortunately, we just haven't seen it yet. We continue to get records that are very redacted and worthless, and we continue to have trouble just getting records in response to our FOIAs in any sort of quick fashion.
Do you have any speculation onto why that's the case?
I don't know. I mean, I think part of it is I don't know how on the face, I don't know that the administration officials who are making these claims really know what goes into a FOIA or really knows what goes into processing a FOIA and how that works. We also had heard early on that, some of the DOJ cuts cut very deeply into FOIA officers. So they're kind of getting rid of the very people that could be very helpful in kind of moving these things along. And then you got to bring in new people to backfill for them that don't have the same expertise. And then just the bureaucracy, can you change course on a dime like an oil tanker that's been, traveling this way for, months and months? It's very difficult to just turn that around. So I think it's a combination of factors, but I also think I don't think there was a full appreciation of what would go into being transparent, fully transparent, or maximum transparency is, I think, the way the director had termed it, Tulsi Gabbard. But I don't know. It's probably a combination. And then there's some stuff they probably just don't want to release, right? Somebody in an agency somewhere says we can't release that stuff to the public for X, Y, Z reason.
So if that's the case, that officials can decide what they don't want to release, and then there's these decisions about what gets redacted and what doesn't get redacted, what what is the good of the FOIA system in a sense? Is it can it be used, actually, can it be manipulated by officials so that there's selective release of documents or selective redactions sort of alter news stories?
Well, I'm certain that there are selective releases for sure. Whether or not that it accounts or amounts to manipulation, that's open to interpretation. I mean, if I got a selective FOIA, I wouldn't necessarily just run with it with a story. I would even these FOIAs that I get that look very promising and are unredacted and have a lot of information. I'm not just tweeting them out. I'm, doing reviews. So a lot of that is really on you as the requester to kind of discern. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There are selective releases out there, and I'm sure that there are, for whatever reason, like I say, there's documents that there's people within the bureaucracy of government don't want you to see. And we know that because every once in a while this stuff emerges in discovery of lawsuits or what have you. Or, in fact, another example of this is we have a lot of the batches of records we get. There's hundreds and hundreds of pages. And I generally will go through them painstakingly and try to read through them and try to understand if there's anything new in here, which is very difficult at this stage of the game with some of these agencies because there's been a lot of stuff already out there. And that's probably where I spend the bulk of my time in review is trying to figure that out, what's new or what isn't. But in the NIH releases recently, we're seeing a lot of the same records over and over we've already seen. These are duplicates. And a lot of it is like, we're getting a lot of David Morenz emails. You know who David Morenz is, obviously. He was a top aide to Anthony Fauci. And a lot of his kind of communications talk about ways to subvert FOIAs because they're getting lots and lots of FOIAs from interested people that are interested in COVID-19 and what was going on at NIH at the time the pandemic exploded or before that. And, they're feeling a lot of heat from scrutiny from outside, reporters and whatnot. And he was communicating, and I think it's well known that he was communicating with a lot of, people about, hey, I'm getting FOIAs. Let's move this to my Gmail account or my private accounts. And, so there's ways to subvert FOIA too, by government workers. So it's not maybe just the folks that are reviewing the records and just selecting what to release or not. But it's a problem.
I did want to turn to talking about your reporting on COVID origins. And maybe we could start with the article that you published when you first, soon after you first started at US Right to Know, which came out in April. I guess I'll read the title of the article. U.S. intelligence agencies' classified analysis offers detailed scientific view that COVID-19 may have come from Wuhan lab.
And that was my first story that I worked on at US Right to Know. But I should say that I am the beneficiary of, some excellent reporting before I ever arrived and excellent FOIA work before I ever arrived. And this is a good example of that. I worked with that story. I worked with one of our staff scientists who works at US Right to Know, Carolina Corinne, who really did a lot of the heavy lifting on that story because a lot of it, when you're getting into sequences of viruses and that sort of thing, is kind of above my head. But I will say that what was interesting about this particular story was we actually got the internal national Center for Medical Intelligence sub-agency of the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency's assessment on whether or not COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 was lab made or not. And this was a analysis they did, a scientific analysis. It wasn't just an intelligence kind of, we're getting reports that say this. They actually looked at the genome of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and what they came away with was that, there were these features that we all know now that seemed suspicious. We're talking about the furin cleavage site and, the S1, S2 sites. And the, what they came away with was that this, not only does this look suspicious, but it we know for sure that the WIV had the capability to do this. And so what there were, 4 very credible scientists that were brought in to look at this. And they came away with, they believed it was manipulated in the lab, and it was lab made, and that escaped from the lab. And so what is more interesting about this, I think, is the timing of when they came up with this, which was early, very early after the pandemic started, like in June-ish of 2020. So there was a intelligence agency, a very, credible intelligence agency within the U.S. government that had that early come away with the assessment that it was likely made in the lab. And we didn't hear about it. Nobody in the public heard about this. Instead, what became kind of the, knowledge base for the scientific community was the proximal origins paper that, some of within the scientific community had said that it's more than likely that this was a natural spillover from, from bat to another species to human. And that became kind of the talking points for the NIH, even though since then we've now come to realize that, the authors of that paper had their own questions about whether or not it was manipulated in the lab, and actually believed it was initially, some of them at least, and communicated those with the top NIH officials, including Fauci and Francis Collins. So, we finally got this these slides showing the assessment, the full assessment of the DIA or these scientists on the genomic assessment, 5 years later, 4 years later. And we were able to report about it. We were the first ones to report on that. But, we haven't seen that level of detail on assessments by intelligence agencies other than that one. Even though there has been a report put out, ODNI put out a report saying, 4 of our intelligence agencies believe it's natural origins, 2 believe it's, there was that kind of report. It was a summary report, but it doesn't have the level of detail. It doesn't say which agencies believe what and for what regions. And so we've kind of advanced the ball with that story.
So when was the original FOIA request put in?
That predates me, but my arrival to U.S. Right to Know, but my understanding it was like 2021.
So why do you think it took 4 years for that to be made public? Well, it wasn't even made public. It was only made public through a FOIA.
I mean, it's all speculative. When you're dealing with it, in my experience, dealing with an intelligence agency in particular, there's so much red tape. They can, like I mentioned, there's 11 different exemptions to the FOIA, categories of exemptions, and they're constantly relying on certain ones, particularly exemption number 1, which deals with national security. And that one gets cited all the time when you're dealing with intelligence agencies. And, I mean, we had to go to court, obviously, and to get these records and to pry them loose. And ultimately there was some sort of calculation. Well, it's 4 years later now. We can put this out there. I don't know.
So then we don't know the motivation, but we do know what happened once that information became public. So what did happen once that came out?
Well, we reported on it. It did get picked up by some news outlets. It did get picked up by national ones that you think of in the U.S., like the Washington Post or New York Times, but it got picked up by, some outlets in Europe. The Sun picked it up. It's various kind of outlets around the globe, really. India, some news organizations in India. So, it got out there to some extent. It didn't get, you probably don't know about it widely in the U.S., although, some in the scientific community know about it. And I think the significance, like I say, really was kind of the timing of all of this. The timing of, there was this intelligence agency that came up with its own lab leak theory that we really didn't hear about until maybe a year or two, or didn't gain any sort of traction until a year or two later. And the natural origins theory was really the one that NIH and the scientific community at large was running with.
From other FOIA releases, is it clear how many people in government saw that DIA analysis? Was that information was that analysis provided to the NIH officials at the time? Or
I
I guess we
That's
don't
a
know,
good
right?
question. But I will say that, there is some reference. If you go and look at those documents, there is some reference, and I think I might have mentioned this in the story somewhere, but how they had a briefing on this. Like you could tell this slideshow that we are writing the story off of, it was a presentation. It was given as a presentation by these scientists. And, my understanding is from doing the reporting around it was that they gave this presentation to, folks within that sub agency, the NCMI, in the mid-June 2020. Now, where it went beyond that, did it go to the NIH? I don't know. You got to figure there's folks within that agency that are liaisons with the NIH and that are communicating with the NIH. So, I do these things stay in silos within the federal government? You might know that better than I do, but I think to some extent, they probably do when you're talking about intelligence, but because you have to have classified clearances and that sort of thing. But I think it's probably pretty likely that at some level, maybe not the detail we're seeing in this particular analysis or assessment, but at some level, there is communication between these agencies, like like the FBI saying to NIH, we believe it's a lab leak or whatever.
But without any direct documentation of those communications, the people involved can simply recall, the famous Anthony Fauci, I don't recall, can be said again and again, that's the importance, of course, of having the FOIAs, if there was a documentation of the communication or that slideshow sent to officials at the NIH. But
Yes.
I guess until we have that, it's unclear how many people actually saw that slideshow. And as you said, it was classified, right?
Yeah, it was top. I think you can see it on the document. It gets crossed out, but I think it was at some level top secret designation at one point. But you raised a point that I kind of touched on earlier about without that documentation. That's why it's so kind of important to look through, even though I generally am looking through hundreds and hundreds of records I've already seen before. I'm still needing to do that, but just in case there is that odd record that pops out that like, holy shit, this was sent to whoever or whatever, because then that you could advance the story that much more.
Well, that point I want to come back to when we talk about your next story, which is something that came out at the end of September. Right, not next, your next story that relates to COVID origins. And this is a story that, at full disclosure, I spoke with you about, and I'm actually quoted in this article. It's an article titled NIH Committee Green-Lighted Wuhan Coronavirus Experiments Despite Concerns, Emails Show. Can you summarize this article for us?
Sure. And I should go back and say, I'm sure your audience knows a lot about this stuff already. So I don't know if I have to explain everything. But, in 2014, the White House put a moratorium on certain risky research on potential gain of function experiments involving influenza, SARS, and MERS-like viruses. So that was existing in 2016. That moratorium was still in place. And what this story was about internal records we got from the NIH about a review committee, an ad hoc review committee of NIH scientists were looking at research proposals that had already been funded by NIH and trying to determine if the experiments that they were proposing were subject to that moratorium. that was put on by the White House in 2014. And in these particular documents involved one of the more controversial projects that has popped up in relation to the COVID pandemic, which is this research project that the EcoHealth Alliance was doing in collaboration with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Started in 2014 and it went into the early 2020s, right? After the COVID pandemic. But in year two, after the second year of this proposal, this grant, I should say, there was this proposal that percolated up to this review committee, and it involved EcoHealth wanting to do experiments with chimeric SARS-like viruses and MERS-like viruses, SARS coronavirus and MERS coronavirus. And what they wanted to do is take kind of fragments, and you know this stuff better than me, but they wanted to take fragments from, one novel coronavirus and put it in another novel coronavirus, a backbone of one called WIV1 in the SARS case, and determine whether or not, they could infect animal cells or, live mice that had been modified with human lung genes, and determine if there was any, enhanced infectivity or what, if they could just infect these cells at all or mice. And so that percolated up to this review committee. The program officer was Eric Stemmy, who oversaw the grant, and he asked the review committee to look at this proposal and determine whether or not they had any concerns, whether the funding pause, the moratorium was applied to it, that sort of thing. And what the records show is this internal deliberation process that no one had ever seen before. And it was very interesting because no one had really seen that kind of level of detail of how they were, determining whether or not this proposal could go forward or not. And you see the actual emails going back and forth of folks, high up scientists in the NIH that are saying, well, technically the moratorium, the funding pause, it doesn't apply to this because it's a SARS-like virus and not SARS. And then there was another scientist who weighed in who said, because they're using just one gene of SARS in their chimeric model, their hybrid model, it probably means that we don't have to run it through the CDC's, select agent program, which would be a requirement and, is a whole nother process of scrutiny in and of itself. So, but what this story is really about is kind of showing in detail those deliberations that no one has ever seen before. And against the backdrop now, and why it's kind of relevant now, is because there is this process going on in NIH now to determine, what kind of standards should be in place for allowing or not allowing risky research or gain-of-function experiments go forward. And so you kind of see this unvarnished look behind the scenes.
I was surprised by how casual and indifferent the discussion was, and also by how much it relied upon the investigator. In this case, Peter Daszak, the EcoHealth Alliance president. It seemed like they, took him at his word and used, didn't do any assessment of whether he was being truthful or not, or how much information he really had relative to the activities at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Were you surprised at that?
I mean, it was definitely something that I, latched onto in the story for sure. I mean, when I reached out to you, I kind of want, people don't really care what the hell I think, but it is nice to hear someone in the community that says, holy shit, this is depressing is the way you put it.
I used
that word exactly. But yes, absolutely. It's always neat. I don't know if that's a word, but it's always interesting to see the unvarnished, conversations happening behind the scenes. And it's not often you get to see those. And in this particular case, you see some of that casualness. You also see, like you mentioned, that Daszak was able to kind of finesse his idea of, or his position of why this wasn't gain of function, and he tried to back it up with some science, but there is other science out there that should have raised some red flags, right? But and then his word, it was very interesting to see that his exact wording in an email of, even if okay, it's not gain of function, but if we got some results that were unexpected, we will, stop this experiment and we'll immediately notify you. Almost that exact same wording was stuck into a letter and given as the condition why this could go forward. So yeah, that was very interesting.
Disgusting is the word I would use rather than interesting. I think especially given the research program that this proposal was, part of, is very likely what led to the pandemic. So to see things happening and unfolding in 2016 and how casual the evaluation was and how much it relied upon somebody who's now in fact debarred from receiving federal funds, yeah, depressing is an understatement. I actually, even hearing you talk about it now, I find myself getting quite disgusted, especially given, as you say, the stakes are quite high right now, where there's an executive order on dangerous gain of function that's sort of sat dormant while and deadlines have passed, and we still don't have a policy that was sort of expected to come based on that executive order. I would say, I guess one thing that, let's see, do you want to comment on how your view of self-regulation or scientists, regulating themselves, has been affected by what you saw in those emails?
I would step back a little bit to just, so these particular experiments that I reported on, I think it's been widely shown, or scientists have reviewed them and said, these were not did not lead to SARS-CoV-2. They
Ah,
didn't lead. Okay.
that's why I'm careful to say, I was careful to say part of a research program.
Right.
So as a
Yeah.
scientist, this is kind of, I get frustrated when trying to talk with people about, especially as it relates to specific grant proposals, and this comes up with the diffuse proposal all the time. If you know what a scientist is thinking about, and you can tell that by their grant proposal, you will know that a lot of what's put on paper isn't exactly what will go on in lab. But you'll be able to say that experiments that would be consistent with this research program could, in fact, have been those that led to the pandemic, which is, I think, it's hard to, the defense of Daszak and his collaborators has always been that, well, they didn't exactly say we're going to create this virus called SARS-CoV-2 in Wuhan and then it'll get out, right? They talked about experiments that could easily be, within a larger research program that could have led to the creation of such a virus. That's, I think, so when I say part of a research program, that's kind of what I mean. And I do appreciate, like, precision in language is important. So I agree that this is not, the project, we're not talking about this is the project that led to, we could say, they wrote this sentence and then that led to the virus. But you can easily see how this is an extremely dangerous set of experiments, which could lead to the creation within other sets of related experiments of a virus like SARS-CoV-2. So
Yes.
to be
Right.
precise, so we're not attacked as conspiracy theorists
Yes.
any more
No,
than
yeah,
we're.
you're absolutely 100% right. But I mean, it kind of lends credence to the lab leak theory, basically. So, yeah, and the question was self-regulation, right? As scientists, I don't know that it's. I think you would have a better sense of this than I would at the moment. It's hard to really say, what's happening internally with some of these grantees. I think, though, government agencies like NIH or FAA, even when I'm talking about the Boeing story or that sort of thing, work with these, particularly in smaller communities, like program officer who, oversees SARS and MERS research. They're working with the same professionals year in and year out. So they get to know these people on a personal level. And I think that that's the same thing that happened with Boeing and the FAA. And that's to some extent, that's part of the problem, really, because you're supposed to be a regulator here and you're not, as chummy as you might become or cozy as you might become with these scientists. You're really got to have your regulator hat on at all times, I think. And I think that, there's some bleed over in that, I believe, that happens. So, I think, sure, there's going to be some lax oversight because of these relationships that have been dating back for years and years. Is there a way to stem that? It probably maybe you need to shake up these relationships every so often. Maybe there should be I don't know. I'm just throwing stuff out there, but maybe there should be, you can only be a program officer on this kind of science for 2 years or whatever. I don't know. Maybe that's not practicable either because you're talking about a very, a specialized science that you want people to have knowledge of, right? So, I'm not sure what the solution is, but I do think, this kind of stuff you're talking about, the self-regulation and the kind of coziness maybe between the regulator and the grantee, it's going to go on and it has gone on for years.
And it's interesting you bring that point up because as a NIH funded scientist and someone that's had grant funding for over a decade, there is a culture in science where the program officers at the NIH and the researchers are kind of supposed to be working synergistically. And there's a reason for that, that actually, in theory, when they're on the same page and they're coordinated, that is actually in the best interest of the public. That all falls apart when researchers are misleading the program officer or researchers are doing experiments that potentially put the public at risk, as is the case with these types of experiments. I also wanted to mention one of the things that was in those emails was discussion. I think, I forget the progression of where in the discussion this happens, but one of the reasons they're talking about the project is because there was what is referred to as a typo in the progress report that Daszak submits, where he says that the research to make these chimeras was going to happen at North Carolina, but it turns out the claim is that, oh, that was a mistake, that really these are going to be done at the WIV. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, and that was kind of when I was digging through these documents, I think that was the first thing that I kind of saw that stood out to me really was kind of just mundane back and forth over these communications over this grant proposal. Um Stemmy mentions to the program officer who overseeing the grant mentions to Daszak, the president of EcoHealth Alliance, hey, I noticed, you said in your paperwork that you were going to be doing these experiments in China, but you listed it as the IBC, the, Internal Biosafety Committee, the overseers basically of these experiments that are supposed to make sure they're safe, is happening in North Carolina under Ralph Barrick's lab. Where are these experiments actually happening? And this is where we start to see all of the details come out. And he basically says, oh, that was a clerical error. This is really, all of the work is going to be happening in the WIV in China. And, the Barrick lab isn't involved at all. But so, or the IBC, I should say. And that triggered Stemmy to run it up the flagpole to this review committee. And he's like, okay, listen, I want you guys to tell me any concerns you might have for having this internal safety body being in China, which is, they're not going to, U.S. is not going to have any sort of direct oversight over these experiments whatsoever. They're relying on this IBC in China to oversee them. And, essentially it didn't raise the concern. In one of the emails that the review committee member, Linda is it Linda Lambert? She said, I'm glad you fixed that error and that the review committee is gonna, is in Wuhan. But of course, the WIV had a reputation, an excellent reputation, internationally, and they also used that as part of justification for moving this grant ahead.
Well, I don't know if it had an excellent reputation. I think they claimed it did, but I suspect, I mean, the bigger problem is if you're offshoring dangerous experiments to another country and you don't have ability to do any sort of oversight of the facilities and what sort of actually implementation of biosafety and biosecurity protocols, it almost makes no sense at all why you would do that, why the US taxpayers would foot the bill for that. And they're, of course, trying to change that now. So I would say, too, though, one of the really the interesting pieces about, uh, Daszak putting in what he claims is a typographical mistake that the oversight's going to be done at UNC, whereas the experiments are going to be done at the WIV, is that through reporting that was done by Emily Kopp in December of 2023, we learned that he was playing the same type of game in preliminary drafts of the diffuse proposal, where in a little footnote on the side of an earlier draft of that proposal, he in fact says that they're going to. Well, I mean, I believe the way I read it is that he's deliberately misrepresenting where certain experiments might be carried out to try to, make sure there's no problems when it goes through the review process. So he was saying that that we're going to claim the experiments are going to be done, that or I forget exactly his exact quote, but the point is that he's trying to mislead the committee to say that, oh, we're going to do these under safe conditions at UNC, but we're really going to perform them at the WIF.
Right.
And as it
And
turns out in under BSL-2 conditions. So he's played these games with locations. And again, I don't know if he's playing games or if it really was a clerical error. But the fact that he has this odd clerical error in this progress report in 2016, and then we later see that he's talking about how you can kind of game the system and say one thing and do another in a draft of the diffuse proposal, raises serious questions about his, I guess, ability to truthfully put forward documentation about what's actually happening or intending to happening, I guess, to try to put
yes,
it
and
lightly.
no, you're absolutely right. And that was actually my first question was like, I wonder if this is intentional because knowing that knowledge of the diffuse proposal, which was to DARPA, right? Not the NIH, but the question was, is this kind of the same thing? Did he intend to try to say that this was going to be overseen by North Carolina to kind of, throw him off or, to
Well,
hide
make
the
them more
fact.
confident to make them think it was okay because
Right.
reviewers would have been like, "Oh, this is better. We'd rather have it overseen at UNC because we know that we can, trust that more than we can trust stuff at WIV," I think
Yeah.
would be
But
my.
what we don't have in these records is the benefit of what Emily's report in 2023, which was, phenomenal stuff. Was that they got a record of a draft document with a comment on the side. This was like a Google Doc with a comment inserted in about, oh, we should say the IBC here is in North Carolina. So we're not raising red flags. We don't have that in these records, but it is definitely a curious thing that I thought of as well. Yeah, it's interesting.
Now, the last thing I wanted to talk to you about was that after your report was published on September 30th, or perhaps a little before that, you received a response from the NIH because you submitted some questions about, I think, 6 questions to the NIH related to this story, and you got a response from them. Do you want to say a few things about that?
Sure. I mean, I should go back a little bit and say that, I knew I was going to be quoting directly some of these scientists on the committee, as well as, citing their names in the report. And so, I reached out, tried to get in touch with each of these scientists, and some of them no longer work for NIH. And I still tried to reach them, but never was successful in doing so. But Eric Stemmy, who's the program officer, does still work at NIH, and he remains a program officer over some of these grants. I reached out to him directly and asked for comment about, some of this stuff, and he directed me to the NIH press office. So the press office got back to me and said, well, he's considering responding, but you need to, submit your questions via in writing. And I generally don't like to do that. I would rather talk to someone, and have that kind of just back and forth and not, so you can, if you have a question based off a question, you can follow up or whatever. And you want to have that, kind of just them getting the question right away and not, coming up with some massage statement or whatever. But in this particular case, I thought this is the only way I'm going to get anything. So in those cases, I will submit written questions, and I did so in this case. And I waited and waited, and I I gave them a deadline, and they blew by it. And then I asked them again when they expected an ETA, and they never gave me it. So finally, I just went ahead and, the story was ready to post. We posted it. Few hours later, I got the email back from the NIH with written responses to my questions. There was a kind of a disclaimer up top that said, this was a different administration, so we're not defending. I'm not saying this. You can read it yourself, but I'm paraphrasing here. But we're not saying what they did was correct or not. But they did say, which I found interesting, was that the White House moratorium did not apply. They specifically said it did not apply to this research, which that's coming from the Trump administration now, saying that the moratorium in 2014 that said there can't be any funding for gain-of-function projects involving influenza, SARS, and MERS viruses did not apply to this particular proposal, which involved SARS and MERS like viruses. So, and I know some of your direct colleagues say that's bullshit. And
Richard E. Bright very clearly thinks that is such a egregious, injustice. It really is so disingenuous. I agree with him completely that to try to claim that these viruses weren't covered under the moratorium is so disingenuous. It's sort of beyond words. And and obviously I was incensed when you published the response that the NIH, the current NIH, and this is from the NIH press team. So I don't know who approved this response to you, but frankly, I was astonished that to this day they're still claiming that was not a complete mistake. Even just to say it was a mistake, that they should have been covered is sort of a bare minimum. But the fact that they were still defending the decision to this day, I was shocked by.
I will say that I was surprised by that line. I'm not, I was surprised that they defended that that was included, that it didn't apply. I thought that was interesting. I'm not on one side or the other really here. I'm not an advocate. I'm not a advocacy journalist either, but I was certainly surprised to see that, so I didn't think that would be something I would see from this administration. But I will say that the answers that I got back from Stemmy weren't really that satisfying to me. I just, he certainly responded to each of them. One of the questions he didn't kind of have an answer at all for was like, I'm not privy to any of the deliberations you're referring to. I asked him about what he thought about his colleagues', decisions in this process where he was asking him, having these interactions. And I sent him the documents, the same documents I sent to you.
This is an important point because you said during the internal deliberations among members of the ad hoc gain-of-function group, you asked your colleagues about additional approvals needed for BSL-3 work and select agent rules. Looking back, is what you ask him. Looking back, do you believe the committee's assumptions, such as Dr. Lambert's take that the experiments weren't, quote unquote, technically covered by the pause, and Dr. Dixon's assumption that a single gene from SARS probably didn't need additional scrutiny under the select agent program were adequately verified. And you're saying you sent him these messages.
Yes.
And his response, which I now find really shocking, is he says, "I do not recall the specific comments from the deliberations you reference," which is not an appropriate response given that you provided them for him. So, wow. Okay. That was a question I had because I thought if you had sent him the emails, there's no way he could have answered that way.
Yeah, I mean, I made it a point when I sent the questions in to say, "Hey, I want you to review these records." I'm not. This isn't a gotcha journalism thing. I want your actual, I read this stuff and give me a response, if a legitimate response. So, yeah, I was disappointed that he didn't weigh in there, and clearly he had those records he could have looked back on.
One, I guess it's noteworthy that the NIH responded, so kudos to them for responding. But the content of the response, obviously, I took great exception to, and I think, I guess it's sort of telling as to where we still are, even though we've had promises that we would have a different approach on this subject, and on trying to admit that maybe some mistakes were made in the past and we can do better in the future. So, is there anything else that you're working on in this space, at least right now in the short term?
We're really keying in now, less so on NIH, but more on the intelligence agencies, because there's been less records coming that have been publicized from them than compared to the NIH. So now it's really kind of focusing on our intelligence agency. We have a few lawsuits. If you look on our site, what I mentioned, we have that story or that evergreen story post about our lawsuits. If you look in there, you'll see that we've recently sued, the DIA again and CIA and, some intelligence agencies, ODNI. But so those are kind of our focus now. But I'm also interested in, away from federal agencies, looking at research like state research labs and, private research labs and looking more at, activities going on in them. And so I think that is also something I want to start reporting on, get some stories out on too.
The last thing I wanted to talk to you about was the FOIA process itself and whether or not it's actually something that is still a net positive or ever was a net positive. And I guess I'm partially basing this on my experience as working for a few months at the NIH as a contractor, with the knowledge that when you're sending emails as an NIH employee, everything is available for the public if somebody wants to look at it. So, um, as a consequence of that, and you saw this with David Morenz, and you also saw this, I think, with some of the stuff that happened in the Defense Department or whatever, people use alternative methods of communication, right? So to have conversations because they want those conversations to not be subject to FOIA. So given that there are all different types of means by which people can communicate, I mean, certainly they can just pick the phone up or they can use messaging apps and whatnot. Should we just get rid of FOIA because it creates sort of administration and a barrier to like additional bureaucracy, perhaps that comes with cost and doesn't necessarily provide the transparency that the public deserves?
And I would emphatically say, no, we do not want to get rid of FOIA. And the reason why is, as imperfect as it is, I'm still getting these records, that all these stuff we've talked about have come from FOIA. So we wouldn't have otherwise seen these deliberations behind the scenes at NIH or the DIA assessment of the genome without FOIA. So, I mean, it took years, and the system is somewhat broken for sure. And there's, it takes way too long to get these records, and there's way too much, hurdles thrown up in order for just regular people to get this stuff. But that's kind of what we got. And even with that broken system, we're still getting records. We need to improve it. We need to make it run way more efficiently. And maybe there should be somebody should be a czar on just that, transparency czar in the U.S. government that comes in and radically reforms, FOIA and how people are or agencies are responding to it. I'd be all for that kind of stuff, but no, I don't want to get rid of it altogether.
Well, I guess my potential issue with FOIA is that you change the behavior of individuals working for government, and you don't necessarily change their behavior in a way that benefits the public. And I can see the point of if you are in government and then there's a FOIA that comes out, like in a news story that's written about the FOIA that takes this small snapshot of, like takes an email or two emails, and then you have a story about it without the larger context. This would be a way, what have heard people talk about to defend some of these things that have come out, that there's an element of, I don't know, I wouldn't necessarily say it's unfair, but you can see how that will affect people's behavior, and it may not affect it in a way that's beneficial to the public. I would like to have everything publicly available from the jump, really. I
Right.
mean, I even talked to Jay about the idea, could we do, this is a long time ago, but about is there a way that your emails could just be given to the public the day, like that evening? Here are my emails from today, right? Like something like that. Just radical transparency where everything was available to the public almost in real time. I don't know if that would be a catastrophe, but the point is, I do agree with you that we should have government transparency. But as someone that's worked in government, I've seen how the fact that the public has access through FOIA does in fact lead to, modification of behavior and a cost to the efficiency of the way the government could run.
Yeah, no, I see and hear your point, and I think, these are good ideas. I think that would be interesting, the radical transparency. I, I think it'd be difficult to do, but, I'm all for it. I'm all for ideas to get on the table to make enhanced transparency and faster transparency for these records, for sure.
So there's transparency, but there's also we want the government employees to be given an opportunity to be the best employee they can. That's kind of my point. I think you're getting less out of government employees because of FOIA, maybe is what I would say.
Maybe, but,
That's my hypothesis.
you're
Whether
also in one way arguing for
secrecy. Yeah.
well,
No.
secrecy, yes, and there is, like I mentioned in these exemptions, there is a carve out for the deliberative process, which is basically, what you're talking about. I want to be a scientist who doesn't feel like the spotlight is on me and I can just speak my mind internally and throw ideas out without having this idea that someone's going to FOIA my emails and see what the hell I'm talking about.
But you're only seeing things on email. That's part of it. There's not full transparency because what you're getting is the snapshot of things that happen via email. Conversations that occur in meetings or whatnot, those are not given to the public.
Recordings, I mean, it's not just written. You can FOIA recordings, videos, text messages, whatever. But most of what you see, correct, it's usually something that's written down or an email or a memo or whatever.
Yeah, don't think I'm trying to argue for secrecy. Unfortunately, what I'm trying to figure out is a way in which the government can be transparent, but its employees can be productive and get things done for the public. Because most of the people in government, my experience, just for briefly, these are people that want to do their job well and they want to do things that benefit the American public. I do believe that to be true. But I also think that there are some unintended consequences of at least the way in which FOIAs are implemented that would work against that. I'm just waiting. I have not been FOIA'd yet. I haven't had any emails that I sent come out. I don't know what embarrassing things that I have or whatever.
Well,
but
you just
maybe
gave me an
someday.
idea for my next
Yeah,
FOIA.
go ahead. I don't have a lot of. I don't think I have a lot of. Well, pump. If something comes out, you could just play this clip. It'll be very embarrassing. No.
Yeah.
I don't think. I actually. I will say this. Anything I've put into an email that's FOIAble, I will at least discuss. I don't think there's anything there, but if anything ever comes out, I'll address it. You have my word.
Yeah. You know what's interesting though about this conversation is even though government employees know that there's this FOIA out there or public record requests on a state level or whatever and they could be FOIA'd at any time. It's human laziness really that you just will write whatever the hell you're going to write in your email. People aren't censoring themselves. And I find it again and again and again.
Maybe that'll start happening more and more since there's been a lot. Like, I think in the wake of COVID, FOIAs have taken on a sort of become like made more news, perhaps. Maybe I could be wrong, but it could just be because I've focused on that particular area the last couple of years that I think that more and more government employees are sensitive to the FOIA laws than maybe before. But what do I know?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm into transparency, and I think you should be willing to say things in public that you say behind closed doors. Like, you should be able to. All that makes sense to me, but I don't know if that is, what you will get with every, I can't speak for everybody, I guess. I don't know.
Sure.
I don't know what the solution is, but I do appreciate your work, and I do appreciate the work at US Right to Know. So, and I'm very much appreciated having this discussion with you, and I look forward to your, future reporting on this topic. And thanks a lot for joining me today. And until next time, this has been Science from the Fringe.